There was much political turmoil and social unrest in the region last year. Our team here at Insight worked to highlight the key issues and bring you analysis of these events as they unfolded. We heard from different perspectives and gave voice to a range of views and experiences. Some were harrowing, heartbreaking stories which only serve to remind us that behind every fact and figure there is a human face. In this episode, we take a retrospective look at some of these stories and how they still resonate today. The sounds of war erupt and explode, so deafening that it drowns out cries for help, dulls screams of terror, and muffles the anguish of loss. When the dust settles, there are those who try to pick up the pieces. Every face tells a story. Persecuted, tortured, and even butchered in the name of war. They have been caught in the eye of a storm. Ordinary people in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Victims of brutality, starvation, and disease. These faces represent just a small fraction of human adversity. So how can their voices be heard above the chaos that surrounds them? Will sharing their stories incite action and bring about compromise, understanding, and eventually resolution? The plight of refugees from Ukraine has been dominating the news since the Russian invasion on February 24th. About 3.5 million refugees have fled to neighboring countries. The United Nations says this is the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. What does the future hold for them as refugees? Can the Afghan and Rohingya experience provide some clues? Rewind to August 2021. Kabul's rapid collapse against Taliban forces stunned the world. Terrified Afghans swarmed the airport, desperate to flee their homeland. Some desperately clinging onto planes as they took off. 123,000 civilians were evacuated by US-led forces. Amajit Singh and his family were some of the lucky ones.
ਅਸੀਂ ਬਾਤਾਂ ਕਰੇ ਸ਼ਾਗਰਦਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਕਿ ਰੋਜ਼ ਮਰੇ ਦਿਨ ਦੇ 25 20 ਮਰਨੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ 25 ਮਰਨੇ ਰੋਜ਼ ਮਰ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਕੀ ਮਰਨਾ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਬਗਾਨਾ ਗੱਡੀ ਪਾਣਾ ਘੰਟੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਖਾਲਤੇ लोग खालते सर रख के सर सट के चले जाने तक बोले आगे कैसे हो ठीक हो अच्छा टास मार के जाने किसने मारा पता नहीं कौन पूछ रहे नहीं पूछ रहे क्यों सानू पता ना ऐसी बड़ी वेखी जो कोने थे गुंडे के आने बात कर रहे टास मार के चले जाने.
After a long, hard journey, Amajit and his family are safe in India. They feel liberated here on the streets of Little Kabul, where Afghan refugees have congregated in southeast Delhi. But the pain of leaving their homes, loved ones, all they worked a lifetime for is still with them. Amajit was a successful grocery store manager back home. Now he depends on charities for donations.
ऐसे ही विचकार लेके आया दूध भी ऐसे ही चढ़ाके थे बोतल भी सब कुछ मकसद अपना जान कढ़ी देगा फ्लैट के विचकार आया एंड जुत्ते तले बंदे ऐसे आया बहुत बुरी हालत आई देगा परमात्मा ने वेखे तो साने वेखे पता उसी तो सानू सब कुछ पता है मजबूरी हालत में सब लोग आए कोई भी खुशी नहीं आए.
Refugees are some of the world's most vulnerable people. After the First and Second World Wars, international conventions and protocols were drawn up to protect the rights of refugees. But not everyone signed on. So countries like India are not bound by these terms. In total, more than 200,000 refugees live in India. The government is reluctant to grant citizenship to everyone, preferring to play temporary host.
There are two concepts in the UN Convention. One is the concept of political asylum, and the second is the concept of non-refoulement. Non-refoulement is that you don't send the refugee back to the country where he or she feels that they are going to be persecuted. As far as non-refoulement is concerned, we fulfill that completely.
From my perspective, what India perhaps could do and should do is have a pool of funds like many other countries have set up. France has a resettlement plan, for instance, for Afghan refugees. So that's your residential papers, that's schooling for your children, that's some temporary housing that the state allows, that's a certain amount of stipend. It's a very respectable way in which you're taking in refugees from Afghanistan, right? And they're not doing it because they've signed up to UN protocols on this.
Feroz is a refugee with no rights. She feels invisible here in a country that merely tolerates her. She manages to earn a little money working at a non-government organization. But her husband, with no special permit or legal status, cannot secure work, and her children cannot attend school. So, even though she likes it here in India, she feels she must move on to a third country.
सोच रहे कि कनाडा का वही बस उसी के इंतज़ार में ही हैं कि वहाँ का कुछ हो जाएगा तो हम वहाँ जाके सेटिंग हो जाएंगे, पर वहाँ का भी कुछ पता नहीं है अभी। बस क्या बताऊँ सर आपको, हम आधा रास्ते में खड़े हैं, ना उधर जा सकते हैं ना इधर जा सकते। ऐसे बस कनाडा की राह देख रहे हैं, अगर उधर से कुछ हो जाएगा तो हम वहाँ चले जाएंगे, अगर नहीं होगा तो फिर इंडिया में कुछ करेंगे, अपना कार्ड वार्ड देखेंगे, हमारा बनेगा कुछ तो अपना काम करेंगे, नहीं तो ऐसे ही रहेंगे, क्या करें।
Once you immigrate, you become a part and a beneficiary of that social security system. That, of course, is a big plus because your insurance and your health and your education, those things are taken care by the state, which, in India, they are out of it. Whatever, social security we have in India, the refugees who are here, they're out of that system because they do not have the relevant documents to benefit from the system in India.
Let's face it, economic opportunities in West Europe or the United States or Canada are much greater than in India. India is, after all, a developing country. So, for them, this is more of a transit stop.
This is another transit stop for refugees, a very different one. Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, is the site of the world's largest refugee camp. 1.2 million Rohingya live here in miserable conditions. Known as the world's most persecuted minority, they have been streaming into Cox's Bazar since 2017, when the Myanmar military began a systematic and brutal campaign to eradicate their ethnic group.
It's kind of hard to imagine, but rivers of mud and people trying to live and use the bathroom and eat all on top of each other. And since then, because of the UN efforts and the international community's efforts and the hosting of the Bangladesh government, you have essentially like a vast camp of 1 million people living and surviving as well as they can. So while things have improved materially, perhaps psychologically, they may be deteriorating because they're not seeing any end to this particular misery.
At just 25 years old, Abida has experienced unimaginable terror and suffering in her life. She was forced to leave Myanmar with barely anything, her young son in her arms. Like most people in Cox's Bazar, they live in a fragile hut made of bamboo and canvas. This was meant to be temporary, but after 4 years, it has become home under constant threats of fire, flooding, and landslides.
Campo mazendila daga za wata sendila ashanti watai budiri 4 বছর 5 বছর বাদে গেন্দলা ওয়াশান্তি watai budiri কে বারমার ঘর তো দূরে দূরে একখান পুরিলে একখান হুরের একখান গইলে ক্যাম্প বললতে গুড়া পুরি যাবে এরদে বাজা বাজা ঘর থারফালর ঘর আর ওইতে জহলে গলি না হারে আরে তো দারো অনেক সুযোগ হলো খান মাঝে পুরা আসো অন্তে যদি আর নাই গরো ভিতরে
এরে অন্তে যদি অনেক পয়েন্টন অনেক হবে না
তো বাইফুতান 7 জন আছে বাইফুত বাজি
এই তারা খেঙ্গুরি বাসি উন্নত
ইতারা বেগুনা আইতে দুমরি দাঁড়িয়ে নেলি যাই রো কে গেলাম মুইও একা জায়গায় বাদে দুজন হাজি গিল গই আমার তো মাকে তেল আঙ্গুরি করি রে তুই ভাই ইবা হাজি গিল গই 3 জন হাজি গিল গই
Mortality rates here are high. Dismal living conditions, contaminated water, and poor sanitation puts everyone at risk. The pandemic too has taken its toll. Access to medical services is practically non-existent. Legally, Bangladesh is not responsible to provide for these refugees as it is not part of the 1951 Refugee Convention or the 1967 Protocol. However, on humanitarian grounds, Bangladesh has allowed the Rohingya to stay, but it is struggling to provide them with the basics. Desperation has driven many refugees to find more sinister ways to survive. Welfare groups have said that residents, particularly women and children, are vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and human trafficking. Here, criminal activity often runs unchecked.
Well, we have invested billions. I mean, that's pre-2017. I'm sure the aggregate figure will cross well above $1 billion mark. This problem is going to explode. I mean, the current situation in the camp is even more horrific. It is the gun running and drug trafficking is everyday affair, and that's impacting the rest of the nation.
Along with serious security concerns, the mass influx of refugees has created many challenges for Bangladesh. And as time goes on, so too does a growing intolerance. The Rohingya are stuck in no man's land. Neither Myanmar nor Bangladesh consider them citizens, deeming them stateless.
Statelessness usually means that a community of people have no connection to the resources, to the services, to the protection, to the laws, to the promise of opportunities that the state or those who are leading, the institutions that are leading a country can provide for them. And the challenge for these people, of course, are what are they going to do? Where are they going to live? Who's going to take care of their children? Who's going to take care of themselves? Where are they going to get their jobs? Especially if their own sense of citizenship is not recognized by anyone.
Helping refugees settle and integrate peacefully, often in the face of distrust and prejudice, is critical, no matter where they are in the world. But finding political solutions is complex. However, it is imperative that we do not lose sight of the essential humanitarian response needed to help some of the world's most desperate people. As Insight viewer Christopher Ealing wrote, the Rohingya people have the right to live and access food, secure housing and healthcare, and quality education. Nations must work together to make these things happen. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has not only highlighted the plight of refugees, it has also heightened international interest in the China-Taiwan territorial tension. Is there an ominous parallel between Taiwan and Ukraine? We take another look at Insight's episode entitled, Could There Be War Over Taiwan? To find out what similarities, if any, exist. At the heart of the tensions, Taiwan sees itself as a sovereign state. Beijing, on the other hand, sees Taiwan as a breakaway province, one that separated from China in the Civil War of 1949.
Mao makes his master move. They must surrender.
Nationalist forces were defeated by the communists and forced to flee the mainland for Taiwan.
Fleeing nationalists embarked to cross the ocean for the island of Taiwan.
China sees Taiwan as part of one China, and they call that the one China principle, and it's very uncompromising. So that is the inherent tension in cross-straits relationship.
I think this is a very important issue, not only for Taiwan, not only for Asia, but for the whole world. If there's any conflict in Taiwan Strait, it will not limit only to the two parties.
The fate of Taiwan will be of immense significance to the fate of Asia. Now, this doesn't mean that China, like Genghis Khan, is going to stampede all over the region, but it does mean that Beijing seeks to arrange a regional order. This is fundamentally a superpower rivalry. It's certainly possible that a war between the United States and China over Taiwan could escalate.
2021 saw tensions over Taiwan at its worst in 40 years. Last year alone, over 700 Chinese military jets entered Taiwan's air buffer zone, almost double the number in 2020.
It is a sign of aggression. That is what it's meant to be. The Chinese government is saying to Taiwan, listen, we can hurt you. We can hurt you with our bombers. We can hurt you with our fighters. It also signals China's intention to rely more and more on military means to achieve their own goal of national unification.
Tensions have been escalating since 2016, when Tsai Ing-wen was voted in as Taiwan's president. A champion of democracy, Tsai took a hard line against China. Now, well into her second term, after a landslide victory in 2020, she has cemented strong ties with the United States and is bolstering the country's military capabilities by spending big on defense deals with the US.
The Biden administration has approved the first arms sales to Taiwan. This was a $750 million deal. The Trump administration, they proposed over $17 billion worth over his 4 years in the presidency. And they also agreed to sell some weapons to Taiwan that had been previously off the table, like F-16s. Taiwan itself is trying to increase its own defense spending, $8.6 billion extra towards its defense budget over the next 5 years.
Located 160 kilometers off China's coast, the island of Taiwan has formidable natural defenses in place. Ukraine, on the other hand, shares a 2,000-kilometer land border with Russia, giving it relatively easy access. Experts say a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be vastly more complex and challenging. Even so, Taiwan is vulnerable. If its superpower neighbor were to flex its muscle, an increasingly reluctant United States would be expected to help.
If the US does not come to Taiwan's defense, then the credibility of US alliance commitments, particularly in Asia, but also in Europe as well, will really come into question. And US credibility will be greatly diminished in the eyes of all of its partners.
While the overriding sentiment on the ground is that China is not Russia and Taiwan is not Ukraine, there are still compelling reasons why China might resort to military action.
We cannot rule out any drastic situations. If Taiwan calls for independence, unfortunately, we're seeing, the Tsai Ing-wen, she appoints the figures of pro-independence in the Taiwanese government and parliament. I think a serious challenge to the status quo would lead to serious consequences.
China's military might grows from strength to strength under President Xi Jinping's leadership. Its nuclear capability is robust, and all kinds of new weapons are being tested.
Beijing was said to have launched a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile in August, catching US intelligence by surprise.
When it comes to Taiwan, he has repeatedly said it will be reunited with the mainland.
我们绝不允许任何人、任何组织、任何政党在任何时候以任何形式把任何一块中国领土从中国分裂出去。
I think the more that Xi Jinping thinks that he can get Taiwan by force at an acceptable cost, the more tempting that prospect becomes for him. I will say from the elite and strategist level, there are many more people in the category that feel like Taiwan is now within reach. And so while of course there are voices of caution to say that this might be costly in the long term, I think for a lot of individuals within that system, that cost is acceptable, given that the huge benefit would be bringing to an end, now over a 70-year-long civil war.
But the world will not applaud should President Xi decide to go to war. Worldwide condemnation and unity over Ukraine serves as a warning. Also, according to the Taipei Times, Xi would not want to risk the economic fallout an invasion would bring. If sanctions were to be imposed, China's economic interdependence with the rest of the world would shatter. And as Taiwan is the world's biggest producer of semiconductors, a Chinese attack would have devastating consequences for Beijing and the world economy.
China could face sanctions, boycotts, tech bans, and it could face ever-growing anti-China coalitions in the global system. So I think for all of those reasons, China is unlikely to use force against Taiwan.
The use of force is the last resort because using force carries with a lot of costs. There is direct cost of military confrontation. Second, a lot of people are going to die in Taiwan and also people on the mainland, the soldiers and the civilians. And also China has to face the problem of how to deal with destroyed Taiwan.
For everyday Taiwanese, the spectre of war may be ever present, but so too is the burning hope that it will never manifest. Like the Taiwanese people, we all desire political stability and social cohesion. But conflict and civil strife can escalate at a shocking pace. We only have to look to the sudden change of regimes in Myanmar and Afghanistan. In a three-part series, Insight took us to Myanmar, Thailand and Indonesia to examine the different and evolving roles of the military in politics. These episodes garnered many comments from viewers, particularly the episode marking the one-year anniversary of the Myanmar coup. Myanmar armed forces seized power on February 1st, 2021. Aung San Suu Kyi's democratically elected government was overthrown. 1 year on, there is still chaos and turmoil as the military regime continues its bloody campaign against the pro-democracy movement. From the Philippines, Alejandro Loterono was against the military takeover, saying the military must be a protector, not a ruler. From Indonesia, Truth Seeker wrote, the military should not be involved in politics. It should only concern itself with the defense of the nation. I hope someday the generals realize that. We as Indonesians felt how horrible it was when the military dominated our politics. I hope someday Myanmar will also become free from the military and become fully democratic. Experts believe military interference regresses the democratic process, sparks significant bloodshed, and creates governments that are terrible at ruling. But there is hope. Indonesia thrives as the world's third largest democracy despite its past. The role of the military in politics came to an end after the fall of former President Suharto in May 1998. Today, the Indonesian military exists as a professional fighting force which remains subservient to the civilian leadership. Insight viewer Armani Putra wrote, "As an Indonesian who experienced the Suharto era, I really feel that Indonesia now is in the best time from a democracy perspective. The 5 principles ideology, the Pancasila, keeps us united. As for the military, I personally have more respect and am proud of them now. They are professional and modern, thanks to the constitution that keeps the military neutral and away from politics." From Ubud Gilbert, Indonesia's history should be a lesson to Myanmar and Thailand. The downfall hurt all aspects of the country, and it took years and years to recover politically and economically. And finally, from Azure Movat, the Reformation was not smooth, but it led to a stable democracy. I hope our cousins in Thailand and Myanmar will be able to resolve their problems with the military dictatorship as well. Last month, Denmark was the first EU country to remove all COVID restrictions, including mask wearing and vaccination passes. Other countries quickly followed suit, lifting the majority of restrictions, if not all of them. But the World Health Organization is telling everyone to hold on to their horses. Declaring a Freedom Day is not the way to go, they say. Of most concern are new coronavirus mutations, emerging variants that can quickly become a serious threat globally. There are countries that are still struggling to cope with surging cases and deaths. Omicron is yet to peak there. But for many governments, high immunity due to vaccinations, low death rates, and less pressure on hospitals have made them bolder. COVID restrictions and testing requirements are being rolled back. The WHO believes this is a bad idea. It reduces the ability to keep the virus in check and to monitor how it is evolving. And from past experience, this virus can sneak up and take hold very quickly. This is New Delhi, 1 year after the coronavirus was first detected in Wuhan, China. Everyone believed the worst was behind them. At first glance, India seemed to have conquered the crisis. Their lockdown strategy, one of the most aggressive in the world, was implemented when the pandemic first took hold.
We were early in declaring a lockdown that, of course, had its own repercussions on migrant workers and others. But in terms of the numbers, that certainly had an impact. The numbers came down, and a lot of people thought that it's over.
In January 2021, infection numbers were around 15,000 a day, with about 175 deaths. Incredible for a country with 1.38 billion people. The government announced it had defeated COVID under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi. By October, most safety protocols have been abandoned and everyone went back to their old ways.
Based on a very incorrect estimate that India had possibly acquired herd immunity. Various antibody surveys were done in a piecemeal, patchy fashion across the country, which of course showed very markedly varying results, but the best results showing a very widespread antibody positivity were relied upon to believe that most of India, if not all of the country, had acquired herd immunity. Of course, the public wanted to believe it. The businessmen wanted to believe it because they wanted to put the economy back on rails. The small trader wanted to believe it because they had suffered a lot. And the politicians wanted to believe it because they wanted to go back to election rallies.
In late September, when Diwali came around in October, people thought that we had gotten over the pandemic and they kind of relaxed completely and started congregating at Diwali time. Then weddings started, large weddings gradually became larger. People started going to malls, and that kind of stuff happened.
But a new and more sinister variant was emerging right here in their midst. Twice as contagious and more likely to put those infected in hospital. The Delta variant, which was first detected in India, was to become the deadliest wave of COVID-19 infections across Southeast Asia since the start of the pandemic.
We did not expect this new viral strain to be so transmissible. This current viral strain is spreading so fast that we've seen that even one person in the family is infected, the entire household comes down with the infection in the next 10 or 12 days.
This second wave hit the country with immense ferocity. Sheer devastation followed. At the peak, 400,000 cases were reported and more than 4,000 deaths per day. There were just too many patients and not enough hospital beds, oxygen, nor medication. India's already fragile healthcare system collapsed.
हमारे सामने उन्होंने दम तोड़ा, हम कुछ नहीं कर पाए। मेरी वाइफ चली गई, मेरे दोनों ब्रदर इन लॉ गए और मदर इन लॉ एक्सपायर्ड हो गई।
How did this human catastrophe of unimaginable proportions occur? Experts believe it was because people thought the pandemic was over. They threw caution to the wind and ignored warnings.
We published the first book on COVID-19, the first book in the world, in fact, in February of 2020. And in that, we warned of a second wave. We warned of mutations. At that time, when we started writing the book, there were no cases in India. And over the last 14 months, we have repeatedly, and when I say we, it's not just me, there are other scientists around the country, have repeatedly warned of an impending second wave.
But the warnings fell on deaf ears. Only 2% of the population was fully vaccinated. In just 3 months, between April and June, the virus infected 26 million people and killed 240,000. Delta did not discriminate. Old or young, male or female, rich or poor, class or caste. Even more devastating was that there was little help for the dying.
Families like mine are now beginning to realize that our lack of a solid healthcare infrastructure is something that can devastate anyone and doesn't discriminate between, the powerful and the powerless. And so this is just a reminder of how bad our healthcare has been and how we've sort of neglected it because we felt that our networks, our connections, our privileges are going to protect us. And COVID has been the great equalizer in that.
Many, like 32-year-old Abhishek, who lost his father and grandmother, blamed the government. They believe Prime Minister Modi should have used the lockdowns to prepare medical facilities and stockpile supplies and prepare staff. The medical sector was already in shambles due to decades of neglect and government apathy.
We are having a shortage of oxygen because we did not ramp up our facilities in time. In fact, in the month of January, we were exporting oxygen to other countries in the world. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. We have to look upon this as a global problem. But the whole idea of a lockdown is to permit time to scale up the infrastructure. We did not do it in adequate time.
Medical preparedness is essential to containing outbreaks. More systems have now been put in place in India. For example, green oxygen corridors were created to transport medical oxygen at high speed from one state to another. Issues of medical supply shortage and other bottlenecks in the health infrastructure were addressed by a panel of experts set up by the Supreme Court. As a result, India was far more prepared when the Omicron variant hit. India is seeing this third wave plateau. Active cases and hospitalizations are declining sharply. To date, 75% of India's adult population has had at least 2 vaccine doses. But COVID is still commanding the headlines. For India, like many nations regionally, the focus is on vaccinating and not getting complacent again. The world is beginning to open up again. Street sounds now resonate in cities. All around us, the hustle and bustle of daily living is resuming. But in the wake of the devastation of the coronavirus pandemic, there lies a lost generation grappling to come to terms in the aftermath. Save the Children reports that 99% of the world's children have been greatly affected by school closures, limited healthcare, lost livelihoods, and even being able to eat nutritious food. The pandemic has put this entire generation of children at risk. The most marginalized and deprived children have been hit the hardest. In the last year, Insight looked deeper into these issues across the region in a series entitled The Lost Generation. 6-year-old Ahmad Munif can't understand that he will never see his father nor his mother again. Last June, the virus stole the lives of his parents within 3 days of each other. His elder sister has now been forced to assume the role of surrogate mother.
Saya cakap lah kenapa Mui nangis. Dia nangis, dia tak cakap. Lepas tu sebelum nak tidur, dia mesti nak bagi ibu dengan ayah. Dia akan pegang kalau seminggu je lah, seminggu. Kalau tak pegang baju tu, dia akan terjaga, dia nak baju tu dengan baju ayah ibu. Dia cuma cakap, ibu masuk syurga Dia tanya macam tu, dia tak sedih. Nangis macam tu tak.
"19-year-old college student Nur Atika and her siblings are COVID orphans, children who have lost one or both parents or primary caregivers to the disease. In the first 20 months of the pandemic, 5.2 million children lost at least one caregiver to COVID-19.
Ayah dah nangis. Macam ayah dah nangis teruk-teruk. Bila ibu ni rasa macam tak nangis sangat sebab macam dia macam tak percaya, tapi masa tu saya tak berapa nangis sangat sebab saya rasa tak percaya macam tu. Lepas tu semua bangun, nenek saya pun nangis semua.
that grief or the loss of a parent is already something that is so challenging for a child to deal with, even prior to COVID. But I think just that, grief is something that has taken on a whole other meaning since the pandemic began for these kids, because they don't, I think primarily the biggest change being that they don't have the usual outlets for support that they would have had before, right? The fact that they're still locked indoors, they aren't able to go to school, they aren't able to socialize. They're not getting the support from their peers or from their teachers or from the community that they would in a typical situation.
These children are lucky. They still have support from their grandmother and extended family. But money is tight and they cannot depend on them forever. So, Nur Atika wants to graduate and get a job to support her siblings. Education is the key. But the grief for the loss of their parents and providers has made it difficult for all of them to return to their books.
So dia rasa macam kalau malas semua, dia tak selesa nak belajar lagi. Tapi ada makcik saya tu, yang cikgu tu, dia push juga dia sebab tahun ni di UPKK dia kena periksa besar juga kan. So dia terpaksa buat juga walaupun dia tak nak belajar, dia malas kan. Kadang-kadang kita push dia sampai dia buat.
Malaysian schools were first closed in March 2020. There were several stops and starts, disrupting learning for 5 million students. While the Ministry of Education launched online learning initiatives, not all children were able to capitalize on this.
Well, anecdotally, I think as long as you have a population that is relatively poorer and has difficulty getting access to the internet, or even worse, access to equipment that will allow them to get to online schooling, it will be very difficult for them to continue with education. I think for Malaysia, as with many other less developed countries across Southeast Asia, it is harder for the rural communities to survive on online schooling for a year. Because of COVID, there has been about a year of no school or online schooling, for students.
As governments in Malaysia and here in the Philippines tried to flatten the curve, one strategy was to keep students out of schools and universities. In the Philippines, children had to endure one of the world's longest lockdowns. It was also among the last countries to reopen schools.
Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte says he won't allow students to go back to school until a coronavirus vaccine is available. He says if no one graduates, then so be it.
Magiging pabigat na lang ako sa pamilya ko. Ganun.
Nag-aalala po ako sa kinabukasan ko dahil sa pag-aaral.
Save the Children estimates that 10 million children will not be returning to school globally. Those from poor families are most vulnerable. When families who are dependent on casual, low-paid or unstable work lose their jobs or are forced to isolate, they have little to fall back on. Missing work directly relates to missing meals. There is also no money for other necessities and medication.
Nung wala pa pong pandemic, medyo nakaraos po kami ng medyo konti. Hindi naman po talaga sobra-sobra. Nakakaano ko ng mga bayarin. Natutustusan ko po yung pag-aaral ng anak kong bunso. Nabibilang ko po ng gatas yung apo ko. Tapos yung mga ibang gastusin po rito, medyo na aanuhan ko rin po na pupunan. Tulad yan, pag marating na yung mga bayarin, di ko alam kung saan ko kukunin yung pambabayad sa mga katulad niya na bayarin. Tapos siyempre, kano lang po yung kinikita. Siyempre, unahin ko po muna yung pagkain ng pamilya ko. Minsan talagang makikiusap na lang sa may-ari ng kahit tulad niya, mga ilaw, kaya tubig.
During the lockdown, Jonathan received about $78 a month in government handouts, barely half of what he used to earn. Like many children, his son had no choice but to work to help put food on the table. Some have taken up illegal and often dangerous jobs to help feed their families.
I don't want to sound overly pessimistic, but I think we have to recognize that we are really facing a crisis that is not only a learning crisis, it's a generational crisis that will affect all segments of the society.
COVID-19 has ravaged the Philippines' economy. The GDP is the lowest in 7 decades. But as governments everywhere begin the long road to recovery, day-to-day issues of poverty, food and shelter must be addressed to ensure that this lost generation does not get left behind. Indeed, there will be many challenges ahead as countries work to recover, rebuild and restore economies and communities. Do keep your feedback and comments coming in. And as we move ahead, Insight will continue to bring you up-to-date analysis of events as they unfold. I'm Genevieve Wu. On behalf of the Insight team, thanks for joining us.